Look what happened now. The Boston Massacre. What a horrible, devastating night. Parliament of Great Britain lost their battle to the Stamp Act, Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, and they just wanted the control of the colonies. So they just started to put more taxes on them. But they started to boycott, which means they refused to buy English items. They said, okay, if they're going to start charging us, then we're going to start making our own things and growing our own things, growing our own tea. So, which meant that England is hurting for money because they still have to pay for the French and Indian War. So because the colonists refused to pay, they sent in British troops to Boston, and they took over Boston, and this is where they were forcing the colonists to pay for their taxes. Well, they became outraged, these colonists, when they see these troops standing there. You just had guards standing there, and it upset them. For what reason do they have to be there? Well, there was some small group of people coming up and taunting one of the soldiers. Taunting is making fun of them, and they started to throw snowballs at them. And apparently, one of the soldiers opened fire, and then they opened up fire. More other soldiers started to fire at the colonists, which has been led to now what they call the Boston Massacre.
Let's move on to March 5th, 1770, the date of the so-called Boston Massacre. There were a series of street fights in Boston that day between angry colonists and soldiers. They continued into the evening.
You big bully lobster! Why don't you go back to England where you belong?
What happened?
That simple-minded brute struck me!
What's that? A fire? There's no fire, but that goon of a soldier over there beat up this defenseless patriot. He did, eh? Well, we'll have to teach that red-coated thug a thing or two about proper manners. Follow me!
Halt, disperse, and no one will be hurt.
Go ahead and shoot. Shoot if you're brave enough.
Shoot us, you lobster-back weaklings! You craven mice!
Don't shoot!
Five colonists' lives gone.
The resentment against the British grew and grew. But King George III didn't pay much attention to the colonists' complaints, as Paul Revere explains.
We are sending letters and complaints to the king, but there aren't enough of us that are upset with the king to make a loud enough voice. His ministers are not giving him the information. So we need an incident, preferably one with bloodshed, that will draw the king's attention and make him ask what's going on in Boston. And to this end came the Boston Massacre.
The incident that became known as the Boston Massacre began on the afternoon of March 5th, 1770, when a fistfight broke out between a worker and a soldier. It developed into a small riot, and by the evening, bands of citizens were roaming the streets of Boston. A crowd gathered and began to taunt a sentry standing guard outside the building known today as the Old State House. The sentry called for troops to break up the protest. When the redcoats arrived, the crowd threw rocks, sticks, and snowballs. And then someone, no one knows who, fired into the crowd. By the time it was over, 5 colonists had died. One of the dead was Crispus Attucks, who's known today as a martyr for the Revolution. The Boston Massacre was an important turning point. It wasn't only an incident that got the king to pay attention to the colonists, as Paul Revere explained. It was also an event that people like Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty could use to turn public opinion in their favor, even if they had to color the truth. So, Adams asked Paul Revere, who was a silversmith and engraver, to design a special engraving to commemorate the event.
Sam Adams came to me and asked me to make that engraving, and we were going to use that to incite the citizens against the British rule. But we had to bend the truth a bit, because the population is divided pretty much three ways. 1/3 of the population is still loyal to the king. Always had one, that's the way it should always be. 1/3 of the population is rebel like myself. We aren't trying to leave England, we're just trying to get our rights as Englishmen that we think we deserve. And the other third is so busy just trying to survive, they don't have time for politics. They care not whether they're ruled by a mob or by the king. But we need their voices on our side, and this propaganda is to draw them to our cause.